Welcome back to the CIO Lifeline. Today, we're going to talk about the Working Genius Assessment, a valuable business tool to help businesses understand how people work together versus individual traits that most other assessment tools measure. We have Terry Gour from NorthPath. Terry has multiple certifications, including the Working Genius. You'll want to stick around for the full 30 minutes on this episode because if you ever have been challenged in your organization on getting the right dynamics together or getting the right people in the room, this tool is your answer. And apologies up front, we had some technical difficulties with audio, so you're going to have portions of this episode that might be a little bit hard to hear. Stick with it because you're going to appreciate the content, I promise you that. Terry, thank you for joining today.
Good morning, Tony. Good morning, Craig. I am happy to be here this morning.
So Terry, quite an interesting backstory you have. Why don't you tell our viewers where you came from and what brought you here today?
Well, I tell you, Tony, I had an interest in technology that started a little over 30 years ago, so I'm dating myself. But through those 30 years, I focused on my self-certifications, Microsoft, Cisco, some of them that your viewers might be familiar with. But about 10 years ago, I realized there was something more important for my journey than just those technical certifications. It was investing in myself with leadership. And so I hired a leadership coach. I worked diligently. I researched certain authors. And I realized something very, very important. For my team to grow, it wasn't about me and my technical certifications. It was how could we change that team dynamic and how could I pour into the others so that we could understand one another better. So I think, to keep it simple, what I realized is it's not about me, it's about others. And how can we pour into others? And that's really what sparked my interest in leadership. I've since sold the organization and started a company called NorthPath, where we're really helping our clients become better themselves and better as teams.
Terry, that resonates with me. I always like to say that I'm not in the IT business. I'm in the people business that happen to do IT. And you're only as successful as those you surround yourself with. So helping to better understand who those individuals are, how they work, tremendous value in that.
So, Tony, I've known Terry for 25 years now because we both owned IT companies and had a blast doing it and saw each other grow. But I saw something change in him, I don't know, about 10 years ago when he really started investing in leadership. And since then, fast forward, growing a company 10X, whatever, and we actually had him speak at the Executive Forum's annual retreat this year on Working Genius, and it was just super important for all these leaders to understand how people work versus who they are. And it's really, I think, between like the 16 personalities or whatever assessment, the Myers-Briggs and Working Genius, those are the two where you could dial in your team and really help them be the best version of themselves. And it's really, really neat to see.
So Terry, what is the Working Genius Assessment?
One of the things that I like to think about with the Working Genius, and let's kind of go to the end game. What is it all about? Number one, it's an assessment that can help raise your team's productivity. And number two, it can help everyone on that team find more joy and fulfillment in what they do. And if you look at those two things, that's really what we all want in business and in teams.
Agreed. Another thing I like to think of in employment is I want a career, not a job. So if I can increase that level of enjoyment and drive and enthusiasm, now I'm in career mode, and that's exactly what I want, and I would think most individuals want as well.
Yeah, I think with reference to Working Genius, one thing that I love about it, and Patrick Lencioni will even say, it's really 20% of a personality assessment and 80% of a productivity tool. And so with teams, there's a lot of times we may work with Myers-Briggs, we may work with DISC, but there's really two things that set Working Genius apart. Number one, it's simple. I can go into an organization, we can work through the model, we can do some real world scenarios, and within about 2 hours, that team can apply Working Genius to what they're doing going forward. And really the other part that's really, really valuable is that it's really applied to work. It's the art of getting things done. So when we look at the Working Genius model, or we look at the 6 steps, those are 6 steps to actually everything that we do.
All right, on the screen, we have the 6 types of Working Genius: galvanizing, invention, discernment, enablement, wonder, and tenacity. Terry, could you break those down for us?
I would love to. And one of the things that we want to recognize when we look at the 6 type of working genius is this really represents the 6 steps or the 6 activities involved in doing any kind of work. And every activity or every project, let's say if we're talking about into the work context, starts with wonder. Someone with a genius of wonder, they love to ask questions like, could this be better? Or is there more potential that we could achieve? And after those possibilities are kind of talked through, it now goes to the genius of invention. The inventor loves to take, let's say, a whiteboard and loves to come up with novel new ideas based on kind of the response to the genius of wonder. The one thing about invention is it doesn't always mean that someone with invention comes up with great ideas. So now it comes to the genius of discernment. Discernment will kind of take those ideas and really look at the workability. They'll look to say, is this going to work? But this one may work better. A lot of times that's based on gut instinct and feel. After the genius of discernment, now we go to galvanizing. So at this point, we've decided this is what we're going to do. This is really what the goal looks like. And the galvanizer really looks at that and says, how do I rally the team around accomplishing this goal? How do I make sure that if we start to deviate away from what this goal is that we've decided on, that the actual team can reconnect to that why? Then it comes to enablement. Those with the genius of enablement, a lot of times don't even think of it as a genius at all. But what enablement comes down to is anticipating what the needs are, supporting that team and making sure that they're there to take it to the next step. And finally, the genius of tenacity. Tenacity really comes down to how do we accomplish this? How do we meet whatever the specs are that we've decided to do? And how do we drive it to completion? When you look at each one of those 6 steps, and hopefully in our team, we can represent a genius with each one of those steps, we have an amazing result that will occur.
Okay, so on my results or on anybody's results, there's also a breakdown of the 6 into 3, call it, sections: working genius, working competency, working frustration. So what do those 3 groups mean?
I love to use a Yeti tumbler, and I'm holding this Yeti tumbler, and this can be an example of how we can kind of think of those. So my working genius, if I were to put coffee in this tumbler, super, super hot, pour the lid onto or put the lid onto it, it's going to stay warm for 6-7 hours. That's our working genius. Those are the things that just stay alive. They stay warm. If I were to open the lid and I were to pour that same coffee in, it's going to stay warm for a while, but not near as long. That's kind of a working competency. And if I were to just have some holes in the bottom of this and pour the coffee in and it drips right out, that's our working frustration. And so that's kind of an analogy of how we can think of the working genius, the working competency, and the working frustration.
How do you use this tool in a group setting? So if I have a department and there's 20 people in that department, are you looking for this blend? Is there not any real ideal situation or results or mix? How do you leverage this information to get the most out of your team?
Ideally, what we would love to see is every genius represented in a team map, as we call it, as we overlay everyone's working genius profile together. But I think there's a few things that we can talk about and how this helps teams. Number one, we can think about it with reference to our own guilt or judgment. And what I mean by that is this. Once we understand our working genius, and a lot of people will say, what is the best leader? Typically, it's a self-aware leader. So we understand a little bit more about what gives us joy and fulfillment. Now, keep in mind with working genius, we're talking joy and fulfillment. A lot of times what that aligns to is what we're actually the best at. So if we can work within our areas of joy and fulfillment, we're doing the things that we do best. But what it also helps us to understand is what our working frustrations are, the things that we may avoid doing or may not be good at doing. When we talk about a team, when we talk about judgment, now we start to look and see, with reference to that team, I may look at someone else and wonder, well, why are they not very good at that? Or why are they not doing that, and judge them for that? Once I understand the working genius, I now understand their gifts and I understand their frustrations and how they apply each one of those.
And that, Tony, that is huge. I mean, if you think about our assessments, we're IG, you're GI. We like to start things, solve things, and then cheerlead them on. And then, T, tenacity, pushing it over the finish line could just frustrate the heck out of us, right? I mean,
Amen.
it gives us a whole new vocabulary and way to work with our teams too, because like I'm an IG, right? So I come up with ideas. I'm like, let's go do it. But then I call Terry and I'm like, Terry, can you discern this for me? Poke holes in it, cover my blind spots, because we're a starter, we're builders, based on our assessments, Tony. And then, getting it over that finish line, like that can frustrate us if we have to keep finishing the stuff to the minor details.
What if we had all GIs and IGs? Knowing this, am I being more targeted in recruitment efforts to build out that team? Or am I overthinking this?
Naturally, the larger the team that we have, the more chance that we have all the geniuses represented. But what I will say is this: there's a lot of times we can work through this by understanding here's an area of genius or here's the area of frustration. We start with the leader. And what we found is that the leader's genius and the leader's frustration count for twice or count double what the rest of the team does. The second thing that we do is we realize that if there's a genius that we're missing, we have some options. We can borrow a genius. So a lot of times we might say, can we go one layer down in the organization? Let's say we're having an ideation meeting, which would typically be that wonder and invention genius. Can we borrow someone to actually sit into that meeting and partake in that and give their perspectives? Alternately, we can hire a consultant or we can hire somebody else to come in to kind of fill that gap. But I can say this: I have seen scenarios where teams have looked at this and slightly adjusted roles or responsibilities to really tweak and become a much better team.
Yeah, Tony, remember a couple of podcasts ago, we talked about driving off a cliff. So if it was just you and I sitting in a room, hey, idea, let's go, idea, go. No one's discerning it and no one's pushing it over the finish line, so we'd be going around in circles. Go, go, go.
Once we're halfway through, I'd be bored as shit, right?
Yeah.
Is anybody else falling asleep?
Yeah.
One of the things that you can think about in this meeting, because I think the genius or the working genius, when you apply it to meetings, has a huge, huge benefit. Think about an altitude that at wonder, which is kind of that in the sky, in the clouds, that occurs at 30,000 feet. And then the genius of invention, which both of you have, kind of occurs a little bit lower, about 25,000 feet. And so we're kind of up in that wonder, invention, and discernment, which is high in the clouds. All of a sudden, we may have some in the team, we call them ETs, or they're more than that enablement tenacity. So they're more in the implementation minded. Amazingly, they take the conversation straight down to tactics. How do we get this done? What are we going to do? And imagine being in a plane that goes from 25,000 feet to 5,000 feet.
Well, and Terry, your analogy is making that from an idea all the way to the ground. All those geniuses play together. And if you can call them out, discern it, now go do it, right? I mean, they work together. And that's a great analogy also.
I love the test. It's 10 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of time. And there's 3 answers, no, definitely not me. Sometimes, somewhat me. Yes, definitely. Those are just natural responses. And as I was going through it, in my mind, it's like, what if someone tries to game this and answer? But it didn't feel that way. I mean, you just answer naturally, be true to the test, represent yourself. And so in both of your lines of work, so Craig and Terry, I assume this is just part of the DNA. This is what you bring to organizations.
Absolutely. I'll tell you one of the things that a lot of the companies that I work with, they love working genius. And Tony, you talked a little bit about the simplicity of the assessment. So it's not a difficult assessment. A lot of times I'll meet with executives and they'll talk about assessments and they'll feel this assessment is soft or it really is too touchy-feely about personality. They love working genius because it's really about how do we get work done and how do we identify which step of the process we're in and who actually gets joy and energy from each one of those steps. One
cool thing is, Tony, we've been talking about the importance of having IT at the executive level. And what I usually have the companies I'm working with take this working genius assessment and the 16 personalities and I put them on the wheel so we can talk about it together. And I'll tell you what, it's not iffy. It used to say, oh, I don't believe in this assessment stuff. But the executive teams are really adopting this because, again, they want that rounded viewpoint at the top. Otherwise, it's too lopsided.
And so you answered my next question, Craig, and that is, what would you pair this assessment with? And you mentioned the 16 personalities. Is there other assessments or tools that organizations should consider?
I'm just shooting with the 16 personalities and working genius because you're giving them the gift of self-awareness, as Terry said. Once people get self-aware of who they are and how they like to work in their sweet spot, and you keep them there, you're going to optimize the organization.
DISC would probably be the first one that I would lead with on the personality side. DISC is, of the assessments, is the one that's been around the longest. probably the most popular, followed by Enneagram, which we haven't talked a lot about, or of course Myers-Briggs. I think where DISC is really important is it shows us, number one, how our personality interprets how we communicate and how we understand how to communicate with others. Where DISC is a little bit weaker, and I would put Myers-Briggs into this, is that when you have multiple personalities together, how do we work better together? That's sometimes difficult to work with just a personality assessment. So that's where I think Working Genius pairs well with either a Myers-Briggs or a DISC to really give us the true picture.
And are you working through HR organizations when consulting with businesses?
There are times we do work with the HR. Most of the time, what HR will get involved with, and this is kind of state by state where there's different rules and regulations. But let's say that there's an important position that they may want to bring onto the executive leadership team or others. I've been asked to facilitate Working Genius for those candidates. And it really allows the organization to understand where they're going to fit in. So those are times where HR definitely gets involved. There's other times where HR gets involved really when it comes to the leadership and the leadership focus of the organization and what we might want to do and work on.
Some of the times I'm talking to these companies and I'm talking to them about these assessments and HR doesn't know anything about these. So we're kind of like bringing it to them and say, hey, pre-screen with the 16 personalities. Then if they've passed that, use like the Working Genius, and it helps fill those positions. But sometimes you got to lead and bring these things to them.
Terry, you mentioned state regs. That kind of piqued my interest. Are you saying there's some states that taking assessment results like this could be considered discriminatory?
Well, it's either the state or it's the stance that the company takes. And so what I'll say is that on the smaller organization, let's say an SMB or a mid-market size, I typically don't have as many barriers to do these or facilitate these assessments. It typically is in the larger organizations where they're looking to see what does the policy look like, what does the state say, and ultimately, I think what they do is they ask the candidate, are you willing to take this?
Now, let's say the candidate says, I'm not willing to take this.
I think it could be a red flag. I think what I would do is it would be an opportunity for me to be curious and say, okay, I understand you don't want to take this assessment. Tell me why. And ask those questions, because ultimately I think it's about the individual understanding that they want to plug into the team and they want to be a great cohesive team that understands how we can be more productive together. And if they're saying, I don't want to do this assessment, they may not understand the value. This is not really something that's trying to exclude someone or something that, let's say the HR team is going to base 100% of their decision on this. It's just another arrow in the quiver to help make the best decision on hiring.
And assessments like this are equally powerful on established teams as they would be for teams you're looking to form, correct?
Absolutely, because in 99% of the cases, we're bringing this assessment to a team that's already formed. We don't typically have the opportunity to say we're going to build the team from scratch and let's look at the assessments. It comes down to here's the individuals we have and how do we understand better where their working genius are. And one thing we haven't talked a lot about is understanding where their working frustrations are, because ultimately, here's the main magic ingredient. If I could say, what's one thing that we want to try to do? Let's try to get 10% more of our workday or our work week focusing in our areas of genius. Okay. Then we leave work, we go home, we're better for our families, we're better personally, and we don't have that dread. Many, many times I'll work with an organization, a lot of the executives, what's the number one complaint? They're burnt out. They're stressed out. They're full of anxiety. Well, what research has shown us is it's not so much that they're doing huge amounts of work. They're working 80 hours or 90 hours a week. It's not that. It's the work they're doing is a lot of times in their working frustrations or the area that does not give them joy and fulfillment. So identifying those areas and figuring out how can we shift this role a little bit, or how can we potentially allow somebody that actually enjoys that to do it? Because a lot of times when we have our genius and we have our frustration, and I'll take some frustration. I believe, Craig, your frustration is in tenacity or enablement. You may look at that and say, I don't want to assign that work to somebody else to do because that's not fun to do or it doesn't provide fulfillment. But actually, if you're giving that to someone that is a working genius in that area, all of a sudden you've given them something that they love to do. And I think another thing that we always want to remember too is just because we have a working frustration in certain areas doesn't give us the permission not to do the work. In my scenario at home, I'm a wonder and a discerner. My wife is an enablement and tenacity. So I think it even helps in our home life because I have my wife take the assessment, and now she understands that, or she understands the reason why I don't love to have checklists everywhere. I don't get excited when we knock 13 things off of the list. That's just not how I'm wired. I can do it because I know it's important, but at least for me, when I'm doing it, I realize this is my frustration, and I need to be really, really careful how much time I spend in that area.
It's truly the world's a better place because people are in their sweet spots, and it's you just don't have that burnout and that,
my team. So I mean, I think it's just the nature of the world we live in. We're lean. I mean, get on an airline. They're trying to wring out every last square inch of that seat, right? It's just baked in their, I'll call it the American DNA. So people are more stressed. The expectations, record banner year. Thanks. What are you going to do for me next year? In fact, what are you going to do for me in 3 days when you're back from holiday, right? A type of test like this to find folks' sweet spots and understand where they thrive and where they're frustrated. This is such a powerful tool. Thank you for that information. And I would hope that for any organization embracing this test, that the leadership team, the C-suite team, take this as well.
What I've seen in organizations, a lot of times we may start with a C-suite if we're able to, but if it comes to another team, and a lot of times what happens is that C-suite will see the results, and then all of a sudden they will apply that to what they're doing as well. Because, as we've talked about, it's simple, it's easy to understand. And for those CEOs or those presidents that don't necessarily believe in assessments or believe in the power of them, Working Genius has the opportunity to kind of change their mind because, again, it's focused a lot on the art of getting stuff done. That's really what they want to do. How can we get stuff done? And a lot of times one of the questions I get a lot is, well, I've got these working frustrations. How do I work on those? How do I get better at those? And the answer is, you don't.
No.
That's almost like taking somebody that's an introvert and saying, how do you get better about being around people all day long and in big crowds and speaking and doing that?
No.
It just doesn't happen. What you can do is work on your geniuses and make sure that you're trying again to keep yourself into those areas of genius and surround yourself with others that have genius where your frustrations are. One thing that we want to make sure of is the team healthy? If the team's not healthy, we don't just want to do Working Genius and expect this is going to solve everything, because we have to have that component of vulnerability and trust to really be successful and utilize this model.
Don't work on your weaknesses, make sure they're covered is what you're kind of alluding to, and just be the best you can be in your sweet spot.
And I like that, you don't avoid your working frustrations. You have to embrace them on some level, but it does help you manage through this better. Having awareness and self-awareness. And I love when you say about team trust.
How many companies do we work with, or how many of your viewers look at their schedule and realize how many meetings do they have, either whether it's with their team, another team, people, and understanding when you go into that meeting, what type of a meeting is this? Is this, an ideation meeting, which is kind of that wonder and invention? If so, I want to make sure that I have, my folks with those geniuses present. Is it more that activation where you're discerning and galvanizing, or is it really more on the implementation side, which is our enablement tenacity folks? But understanding each one of those meetings and even calling it out to say, hey, I need your W here. I need your I here.
That's deep, Tony, and that's cool. It's like, hey, we got to get things done. Don't come up with any more ideas. We got Friday.
Right. You keep Craig out of the room, please.
Yeah.
We got to get done here.
we got to get stuff done.
Because I never thought about just calling that meeting out. We think about, okay, it's who we are, but okay, this meeting is all about ideas and wondering what's possible, and let's get that going. Or we're going in and we got to get this thing over the finish line, making sure those right people are there that can go and just push it over.
For sure. So what's the average team size that you work with?
It seems to be about 8 would be about the average team size that I would say. Anywhere from 6 to about 10 would be the average team size. Now, when I say a team, I'm not talking necessarily a cross-functional team, but a team that, let's say, reports to one leader.
If our viewers were interested in going down this path with their own team, and let's say it is in that, call it 8, how much time is invested? Where do they start? Like, maybe walk us through that process.
There's a couple different ways. So one way is they can go to workinggenius.com. They can go through the assessment and really start to understand how that assessment applies to them individually. One other way is they can work with a certified Working Genius facilitator such as myself. If I were going into an organization, we would send the assessment out. As you mentioned, Tony, it's about 10 minutes or so. So it's not a big time commitment there. And then I would typically bring a team together for 2 to 3 hours to really review the assessment, the results, kind of talk through in much greater detail some of the things that we've covered here. And then I typically, about a month to 2 months later, have a 1 hour check-in with that team to see how they're applying it and make sure that what we did wasn't just a single event, but was a process that they continue to work with. We need to work diligently with the leader, so pretty much a 30-minute to 45-minute conversation with the leader beforehand to really make sure that we're accomplishing the goals, make sure that the leader understands his or her genius, because again, the leader's genius typically applies twice to what the results of the organization, both on the frustration side and on the genius side.
We had Terry do that workshop for executive forums, and we sat at tables, and we all knew our geniuses at that point, and they gave us a mock project. We went through it, and you could just see the people that were ideation and the people that were trying to get it over the finish line. And then we did a retrospective on, okay, what did you guys learn from it? And it's weird when you call it out and you have those letters on your head, per se, and you see it just clear as clear can be. It's a pretty neat thing.
I feel like that the best value would, I'll say, require a facilitator. I mean, I went through my assessment, and it's verbose and it's intuitive, but I really like the idea of having someone like yourself in the room or on the phone to help guide and get us thinking about putting this to the best use possible.
Again, focusing back with Working Genius, what is it really about? These are the areas that give us the most joy and fulfillment in what we do. A lot of times those are areas that, again, are what we are the best at doing. I've seen plenty of people take this and they might have working frustration that because of their job, because of their role, or maybe their past history, they've become quite good at it. It's just not something that provides joy and fulfillment. And as the day wears on, they drain and it becomes much, much more difficult.
I love the chemistry with this. Like it's if you have, I'll say, the right group around the table. Now, I think this helps determine sweet spots and as a guide of having what you think would be the most effective team around the table, but it's the chemistry side of it. This is not an absolute outcome or formula driven thing. It's just getting a powerful mix of people around the table, and then their wings just spread.
One thing that I've heard at a recent workshop, and I think this kind of sums it up really, really well. There was a gentleman, and I typically will ask for questions, and I love to get comments because Working Genius, it really gets everyone's mind thinking. And he said, Terry, I don't understand why they call this Working Genius, because when I'm working in my genius, it doesn't feel like work to me. And I said, you know what? You just summed up Working Genius with that statement.
And you're not going to send them to a workshop to learn these traits. I mean, this is in your wiring. Of the 6 genius categories, there's not any one that would be a detriment or a preventer or prevent someone from being a great leader, right?
And as long as you have your team covered, right? You want to cover all the geniuses. Then whatever the leader is or whatever, you just got to make sure you have that enablement covered. So there's somebody's driving it over the finish line, somebody's discerning to make sure you're not driving off a cliff. Making sure that you got that balanced team.
I could be the best head coach in the NFL if I don't have the best players or capable players underneath me. That all the coaching in the world isn't going to amount to much. Build the right team around you. Terry, thanks for joining us today. Great information. You helped educate us on the Working Genius, the power that this assessment brings to organizations and leaders.
Tony, Craig, thanks for having me this morning. Any further information that your viewers may look to, you can go to workinggenius.com to find out more about the Working Genius assessment. Of course, my contact would be northpath.net or email info@northpath.net.
I'm always smarter after every episode we do. Until next time, thanks again. A valuable business tool to help.
See, Tony, see, Terry, that's how we roll.
Yeah.
Love it. Sorry, Tony, they're testing some kind of a siren. Let me see what's going on. If my eyes went weird when you were talking, it's like, I don't know if you can hear this or not.
Yeah,
Oh
we
yeah,
can.
no worries. Yeah.
Fire alarm testing, right?
I thought there was cats fighting at first. Oh, he's
Yeah.
gonna
I didn't know what the heck that was.
my results, and we'll share these results, all of us. I also
Something went wrong. Please try again.
we're good.
Sometimes what happens with my iPad, if someone says Terry, it'll think it said Siri and it'll do weird stuff. So yes, that's what other.
Yeah, I have a massage chair about 10 feet away. Sometimes I'm talking and it'll go, I'm here. You know, like, bitch, I didn't say anything, you know? So, no. All right. All right. I'll wait to ask about the assessment when the cats are back.
Yeah.